Welcome to your studies at Indiana Bible College. I'm Kenny Noble, and I'll be your instructor for this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to examine the basics of structure for a novel. As a disclaimer, I want to say from the start that there's no 100% correct or right way to write a fiction story. For everything that I say, I'm sure that you can find a good story that works quite well without some of the points that I'm making here. However, today's reader is more savvy than any previous generation. There's a tremendous competition among stories, even good stories, because a reader can only read so much. And today's reader has high expectations for the story they choose. If you publish your novel, it might sit on a bookshelf along with dozens or maybe even hundreds of other stories. And if you want your reader to pull your novel off the shelf and take it home with them, then your story is going to have something worthwhile to offer the reader. Long gone are the days when an author could spend several pages describing the setting or talking about the mood or even the backstory of a character on the first few pages. Today's reader is influenced by the multi-million-dollar TV and movie industry, and we have to accept that. And they expect to be entertained from the very first page, in fact, from the very first line. When the reader picks up your book or your story, you as a writer have actually made an unspoken promise to that reader that you will make the story worthwhile. You're inviting them to come along on a journey, and you're promising them that it's going to be a good journey. So as an author, you have no choice but to write the very best story you can possibly write. In my pursuit of learning everything I can about fiction writing, I've discovered that there's a great source of information from those that teach writing the screenplay and the play. And even though the screenplay isn't the medium that we are trying to write, the screenplay medium gives a lot of information about story writing. Don't forget, many movies were made from novels. They rewrite them and change the name. In addition, all movies were a screenplay first. In fact, I've downloaded several screenplays from the internet free of charge to read. And keep in mind that for a publisher to produce a novel, there's not near the financial risk to produce a novel as there is for the movie. There's been many books that had a print run of 5,000 or less, which I imagine it probably amounts to less than 50,000 for any publisher. On the flip side, nearly all movies start at $1 million and go up from there. That being true, the screenplay must have a higher rate of success to justify that financial risk. Therefore, more attention is going to be paid on the structure of the screenplay because they want to make certain it's a financial success. And although there are a few differences, a good story, whether it's a screenplay, a play, or a fiction story, a good story is a story. In contemporary fiction, the most modern structure is the three-act structure. A good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our modern culture is attracted to this structure. We like it and we can never get enough of it. I don't know, maybe it's the rule of thirds that kind of gives the story a completeness. Or maybe we just like the three-part structure because it resembles our life so much. We have a morning, the day, and then the night. Each of us are born, we live, and then we die. Regardless, if you want your story to be a success, you do well to pay particular attention to these three divisions. Act 1 is the beginning and has certain qualities and plot points that are usually present in every story, and we're going to talk about them. I know some argue that structure imposes on their creativity, that it's a formula, that it stifles their writing. I agree that this is a formula, but it works, and so we should use it to our advantage. But I tend to think that it doesn't really stifle the author as much as it frees them up. It lets the author know the boundaries, and therefore the author can work within those boundaries and explore more in depth the areas within the boundaries. So let's have an overview first. The beginning should at minimum reveal the story problem that the main character is going to have to face throughout the story. The middle should explore that problem. The ending should allow the main character to find a solution to that problem. Stated another way, the beginning is like chasing a man up a tree. The middle is like throwing rocks at him. And the ending is like the man getting down from the tree and escaping. So let's go back to the beginning. There are no rules as to how long the beginning needs to be, but again, in successful stories, the beginning is 25% of the overall length of the story, novel or screenplay. For the novel, this is often called the first 3 chapters. I know some stories don't have chapters, and lately it's kind of been a fad that chapters are really 1 or 2 scenes, and they're doing this because many people are downloading a chapter at a time to their cell phones and reading them. But in the past, the first 3 chapters has often been called the beginning. And in fact, when you send your synopsis and your story into the editor or agent, they'll often ask for only the first 3 chapters because they know that the boundaries should be well established by the end of chapter 3. The audience should know exactly what the story problem is. I challenge you to find any successful novel and divide it into 25% increments, and you'll certainly find that at the end of 25%, we're leaving the beginning and going to the middle of the story, leaving Act 1 and going to Act 2. And this works the same way in a screenplay or a movie. So for a 90-minute movie or novel, at around 22 minutes, give or take 2 or 3 minutes, we're going to have all the bases covered in Act 1 in the beginning, and we're moving into this new territory of Act 2. By the end of this lecture, you'll discover that many of the key elements that's required in the beginning or in the introduction will have taken place before that 22 to 25 minutes are up. And I was surprised when I went to the library and picked up stories at random and began to search through them. And I validated that this principle is true, and it isn't difficult to find it at all. So what all is in an introduction? What goes in the beginning? First and most important, the beginning has to include the story problem. By the end of the 25%, the audience should know exactly what's at stake and what the main character faces. Something should upset the main character's world, and life as they know it should no longer exist because now things are turned upside down and they must face the story problem. Often they've gotten by in the past. Second, something that we often overlook is the audience needs to see the main character's world and how they're living before the main character's faced with that disaster in their life. So let us know what the main character's life is like. Let us see a little bit of it first. Now, you'll still have to have a story problem there. You'll still have to have something wrong to grasp the reader's attention, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the main story problem. So, for example, let's look at the first Disney movie of Shrek. The story problem was Shrek had to save the princess from the dragon. Yet when the story opens, we don't know that's the story problem right away. The problem that we see Shrek facing is there's just so many animals that's taking over his territory, that's moving in and making it unpleasant for him. So yes, he has a story problem, but he doesn't know that he's going to have to rescue the princess yet. So let us see what the main character's life is like at the outset. So that way there's a contrast. When this problem comes and upsets their life, there's a contrast and we can see how things are changing for them. If we see the story problem at the very outset, then that doesn't let us know the character and know how much of a change that's happened for them. Another thing that needs to be in the Act 1, in the introduction, is we need to learn to like the main character. I've mentioned this in another lecture, but it's so important it bears repeating. Let us see at least 2 or 3 things about the main character that is attractive to us. For example, maybe they have a great skill at something. Maybe they are liked well by children. Maybe they are better at something on their job than anyone else, because we tend to like those kind of people that are good at something. We respect that. We need 2 or 3 things, though. So maybe the main character is in jeopardy. They're facing tremendous odds. Let us see that early on, that maybe if they're a school teacher, the workload is just so heavy they can't hardly take it. Or maybe they're juggling their job with also raising the family and taking care of a parent. And we feel kind of an empathy for them or a sympathy for them because they're facing such extreme odds. And I spent a little bit of time in a previous lecture on these qualities, so you can go back and listen to that. But you want to do something in the introduction to make us attracted to and to to want to root for and care about the main character. Another point that often shows up in the introduction is the main character is faced with a quest or a problem, and they just simply refuse to face the problem. Perhaps it's an FBI agent or a policeman, and they're given a chance to take a special case, and they don't want anything to do with it. Or perhaps it's a job situation, and the main character is offered a special job, a raise or a promotion, but they don't want it. They refuse it. So oftentimes the main character in the introduction is facing the main problem, and they simply refuse it. And you'll see this in a lot of stories. Another thing in the introduction is often the main character, once they're faced with this problem and they refuse it, they're visited by, or they visit someone that they respect that's kind of a mentor to them. And this mentor, sometimes called the guardian, encourages them to take the quest, to take the offer, to take the job, to go visit the family, to go to the high school reunion. Sometimes this guardian even gives the main character a gift of some kind, whether it's a gift of wisdom or whether it's some special power or some tool. So the main character refuses to go on this journey or to face this problem, and then they go to the guardian, and the guardian helps them decide. And then the main character accepts the story problem or the quest. And probably the last thing I want to mention about the introduction, often authors look at the beginning or Act 1 as the main character's old world, as things were. And when they go into Act 2, then this becomes the new world with a new set of rules. The thing that comes to mind right now is one of C.S. Lewis's story where the characters went through this closet door at the end of Act 1, and they entered into this completely different world. Sometimes you'll see this in stories where the main character has to get on an airplane and fly to a different place, or they'll get in the car and they'll drive to the different place. So that's called crossing the threshold. Maybe they have to cross the gangplank and get on the ship to travel to the new area. So they've crossed the threshold from their old world to the new world. Perhaps they get in their car and drive down the road, and we have a physical threshold that we see. So that's very interesting. Act 1 is 25%. The ending, Act 3, is usually 25%. And the middle, Act 2, is usually 50%. And the middle has several plot points or several basic moves that take place that readers are accustomed to and we kind of expect. And when we find them, it gives us a satisfaction in reading the story. In Act 2, the main character starts out facing this obstacle or this story problem, and nothing works out right for them. They try and try and try, and they try different ways, and things won't work out right for them because they're trying wrong. They haven't learned yet what they need to do. So the first part of Act 2 is the main character not knowing what their problem is, not knowing that they're really doing things wrong. They just feel like they're right. The second part of Act 2 is the main character discovers what they're doing wrong, but they have difficulty changing themselves. So many authors think of Act 2 in two divisions. They have the first part of Act 2 and the second part of Act 2. The first part of Act 2 is considered the unknowing, where there's difficulties and the main character can't seem to get a handle on what's wrong. About the middle of Act 2, the main character often has what many call the moment of grace. One of their friends or someone points out to them, this is what's wrong with you. This is your problem. Sometimes that moment of grace comes from the main character looking in a mirror and seeing themselves and maybe having a flashback or thinking of the different things that people have tried to say to them or how people have warned them, and they finally figure it out. But that's somewhere around the middle or just before the middle. The main character gets this moment of grace, this moment when they realize, have an epiphany that, hey, this is what's really wrong with me. Then after that moment of grace, they begin to try to change themselves and put what they've learned into action. Thus, the last half of Act 2, or the middle, becomes the area where they keep trying to overcome this problem. So, for example, if it's a romance and the main character doesn't trust anyone and she can't have a serious relationship because of trust issues, then maybe her best friend tells her, hey, you know what's wrong with you? You just can't trust people. Something happened in your childhood that caused this, and you need to open up. You're always sabotaging your relationships because you're afraid to be committed where you'll have to trust someone. And then from that point on, she begins to make little baby steps of trying to change. Act 2 is so big because it's 50% of the story, it's easy for the story to get boring. So by nature, the story demands something to happen around the middle of Act 2. And this has come to be known as the ordeal. And this is when the main character comes face to face with usually the antagonist. It looks like the main character is not going to survive. And except for the reader being able to look at the other pages that follow, they would think that this story was ending, because it looks like there's no way on earth for the main character to come out. But the main character does come out and survive this ordeal and becomes a better person for it. And again, that's usually around the middle of Act 2 or sometimes later. Act 3. Again, leaving Act 2 and going to Act 3, or leaving the middle and going to the ending, there's often that threshold thing again. It might come as a form of a journey, going into new territory. And then in Act 3, things begin to wrap up. But they don't wrap up until the main character faces a near-death experience with the antagonist. If this is a romance, then it might be that the relationship has broke up. Maybe in the middle, there's the first kiss, but now at 75%, as we enter Act 3, there's the breakup. The main character discovers some new information about the romantic interest and realizes they can never be together, and so they break up. But Act 3 should have this battle, and oftentimes there'll be a false ending and a real ending. So, for example, the main character may face the enemy, the antagonist, head on, and there's a tremendous battle, and it looks like that they're about to lose, but they defeat the enemy. And just as it looks like they've won, then perhaps the antagonist henchman comes along, and they have to fight another battle. And you'll see this kind of a double ending in many stories. And finally, Act 3 will include the main character being able to face the world after they've solved the problem, and the reader must know that everything's going to be all right. A story doesn't necessarily require a happy ending, but we like that sense of fulfillment, knowing that the main character's world is straightened out. They've overcome this problem that they had, and now they have new information, and they're a better person for it. So there's some of the things, kind of the basics of structure for a story, and hopefully that'll give you some ideas and help you to get started on your story. There's much more. We could talk all day about structure of stories, and there's different ideas of structure, but I've just tried to mention some of the basics to give you a good starting place.